The wind, a mournful whisper through the skeletal branches of November maples, was Elias Thorne's most constant companion. It swept across the fallow fields of his small farm, rattling the loose pane in the kitchen window, a sound as familiar as the ache in his leg and the tremor that danced in his hands. He was an old man, well past 80. His body, a chronicle of a life lived hard and a war fought long ago. The land, like him, was worn, yet it held a stubborn beauty, a resilience that Elias understood deep in his marrow. He was a widower, his beloved Martha gone 5 years now, her absence a hollow ache that time had softened but not erased. Each Tuesday, weather permitting, Elias undertook a small pilgrimage. His truck, a relic of a kinder automotive era, would groan to life, and he would drive the 3 miles into the town of Havenwood. His destination was not the diner or the post office, not initially. It was the small, often overlooked war memorial at the edge of the town square, a granite obelisk etched with names, surrounded by a patch of earth that frequently surrendered to weeds. Beside it, almost forgotten, grew a single, tenacious rosebush. It was this rosebush that called to Elias. Martha had loved roses. His approach was slow, each step with his pronounced limp, a negotiation with pain. Shrapnel from a lifetime ago remained lodged deep in his thigh, a cold, metallic memory. Reaching the rosebush, he'd kneel carefully, the ground unforgiving to old knees. His hands, marked by a persistent tremor, another souvenir from the war, from the blast that had nearly taken his leg and his life, would hover, then steady with immense effort. He'd pull the weeds with a gentle persistence, prune a stray runner, his breath misting in the cool air. He rarely spoke to anyone during these ministrations. It was a private communion, an act of tending that was as much for the bush as it was for the quiet echoes in his own soul. He did not think of it as kindness, merely a thing that needed doing, a small tribute to memory, to endurance. The future impact of this, or any of his quiet ways, never crossed his mind. He lived in the present, tethered to the past, with little expectation of what lay ahead. The town of Havenwood, like many small towns, had its share of shadows alongside its charm. For Elias, that shadow often took the form of youthful carelessness, a casual cruelty that stung more than he ever let on. One crisp afternoon, as he made his way from the general store, a bag of chicken feed clutched precariously. The tremor in his hands was particularly pronounced. A group of teenagers, lounging on the bench outside the hardware store, watched him. "Look at him shake." One snickered, a boy with hair the color of straw and eyes that hadn't yet learned empathy. Another, bolder, mimicked Elias's limping gait, exaggerating it into a grotesque lurch. Laughter, sharp and unthinking, followed. Elias heard them. The sound was like stones thrown against an old, weathered door. He paused, his grip tightening on the bag. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, the familiar ground unsteady. He did not turn, did not acknowledge them. He simply drew a slow breath, squared his thin shoulders, and continued his uneven journey towards his truck. The laughter faded behind him, but the echo of it settled in the quiet spaces of his heart. It was not the first time. The invisibility of age, compounded by the visibility of his disabilities, made him an easy target for the thoughtless. He expected no reward for his quiet life, but the barbs of dismissal, the casual mockery, were a heavy cloak to bear. A week later, notices appeared around Havenwood. Veterans Day was approaching, and the town council, in a rare burst of civic ambition, had arranged for a special guest to attend the modest annual ceremony, Major General Alistair Davies, a decorated officer from the state capital. The news caused a stir. Such dignitaries rarely visited Havenwood. Elias read the notice tacked outside the post office, his lips moving silently over the general's name. A flicker of something, a distant memory, tried to surface, but he pushed it down. Crowds and ceremonies were not for him. He preferred the solitude of his fields, the company of the wind. His neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose kindness was as reliable as the sunrise, found him later that day by his fence line, mending a loose wire. "Elias, you'll be at the ceremony, won't you?" she asked, her voice warm. "It's important to show up for all of you who served." Elias fiddled with the wire, his gaze distant. "Not much for fanfare, Eleanor. Best leave it to others." "Nonsense," she said gently. "You're as much a part of this town's heart as anyone. More than most, I'd wager. That general, perhaps he'll have something worthwhile to say." Her words, sincere and unassuming, chipped away at his reluctance. The thought of a high-ranking officer, someone from that other life, stirred a faint, almost forgotten sense of duty. That evening, Elias opened an old wooden box. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, lay a few modest service medals. He picked one up, its bronze cool against his trembling palm. He polished it slowly, not to a shine, but to a state of quiet dignity. Perhaps he would go. The day of the ceremony dawned clear and cold. The town square was adorned with flags, their colors stark against the pale blue sky. A small crowd had gathered, bundled in coats and hats, their breath pluming. Elias stood at the very back, near the ancient oak tree, content to be an anonymous observer. He wore his old, clean overcoat, the modest medal pinned to its lapel, almost hidden. The mayor spoke, then a local historian. Finally, Major General Davies strode to the makeshift podium. He was a man who carried his authority with a quiet confidence, his voice clear and resonant as he spoke of sacrifice, of duty, of the enduring spirit of those who had served. His words were not platitudes. They carried the weight of experience. As he concluded, his gaze swept over the crowd, a polite acknowledgement. Then his eyes, sharp and discerning, seemed to pause. They narrowed slightly, focusing on the figure at the edge of the gathering. Elias, feeling the sudden intensity of that gaze, shifted uncomfortably. The general finished his remarks, descended from the podium, and began to move through the crowd, shaking a few outstretched hands, but his path seemed directed. He moved past the mayor, past the council members, his eyes still fixed on the old man by the oak tree. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Who was this elderly man that had captured the general's unwavering attention? General Davies stopped directly in front of Elias Thorne. The crowd hushed. For a long moment, there was only the crisp autumn air and the distant caw of a crow. Elias felt a flush creep up his neck. He looked at the general's polished shoes, then hesitantly up to his face. Recognition, startling and profound, dawned in the general's eyes. Then, Major General Alistair Davies, a man of considerable rank and renown, drew himself up to his full height. His hand snapped to his brow in a salute so crisp, so imbued with respect, it seemed to vibrate in the silent air. "Sergeant Elias Thorne." The general's voice was unexpectedly emotional, yet clear for all nearby to hear. "It is an honor, sir." Elias blinked, stunned. The title, Sergeant, was one he hadn't heard addressed to him in decades. He instinctively started to raise a hand to return the salute, but his tremor made the gesture awkward. He lowered it, a look of confusion and humility on his face. "General, I don't understand." The general lowered his salute, but kept his eyes locked on Elias. He turned slightly, his voice carrying to the now utterly silent and captivated crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone somber, "some of you may see an old man before you, struggling with the burdens of age, but I see one of the bravest men I have ever known." He paused, gathering his thoughts, his gaze returning to Elias with a reverence that was palpable. "It was 50 years ago, almost to this very month. A different war, a different land, but the same courage that defines the best of us. I was a young lieutenant then, green and terrified, leading a platoon into a valley that turned out to be a hornet's nest." His voice dropped, painting a vivid, grim picture. We were pinned down, taking heavy fire. Wounded men were crying out, a sound you never forget. Our medic was Sergeant Elias Thorne. He gestured towards Elias. He didn't stay in cover. Again and again he went out under a hail of bullets and mortar fire. I saw him drag 3 men to safety, staunching wounds, offering comfort, all while shrapnel flew around him like angry bees. Then our position was hit directly. I was down, bleeding badly, convinced my time was up. The general's eyes glistened. Through the smoke and the chaos, a figure emerged. It was Thorne. He was already wounded himself. His leg was a mess, but he got to me. He worked on me, his hands surprisingly steady despite the hell around us, telling me I'd be all right, even as he was clearly in agony. He looked directly at Elias. You saved my life that day, Sergeant, and at least 6 others. You took more fire shielding us, which is how you got that tremor, isn't it? Nerve damage from another piece of shrapnel in your shoulder, while you were protecting a fallen comrade. Elias looked down, his face etched with a mixture of old pain and profound humility. Just doing my duty, sir. What any man would do. No, Sergeant, General Davies said firmly. Not what any man would do. What a hero does. You were recommended for a high honor. But in the confusion of the withdrawal, the paperwork was lost. You were evacuated, and we never reconnected, until now. The group of teenagers who had mocked Elias stood frozen near the edge of the square. Their faces, moments before full of youthful arrogance, were now masks of disbelief and dawning, sickening shame. The boy with straw-colored hair looked as if he might be ill. The casual cruelty they had displayed now seemed monstrous in the light of this revelation. The silence that followed the general's words was profound. It was a silence of awe, of respect, and for many, a deep, uncomfortable shame for their collective oversight. The old man they had seen as merely frail, slow, perhaps even a burden, was a man of extraordinary courage, his disabilities not signs of weakness, but sacred wounds of sacrifice. When the formal part of the ceremony ended, and the general spent a few more minutes speaking quietly with Elias, a warmth spread through the old medic that had little to do with the weak autumn sun. The general clasped Elias's trembling hand in both of his own. Thank you, Elias, for everything. The army may have lost your paperwork, but I never forgot your face or what you did. As Elias turned to leave, his passage through the crowd was different. People stepped aside respectfully. Eyes that had once slid past him now held a new light. Admiration, gratitude, even apology. No one spoke directly of the general's revelation, not then. It was too raw, too profound for easy words. The teenagers who had mocked him were gone, vanished into the anonymity they clearly craved. In the days that followed, Havenwood began to show its changed heart in small, quiet ways. Anonymity was the language of its recompense. One morning, Elias found a freshly baked apple pie on his porch, no note attached. Another day, the rickety gate to his front yard, which he'd been meaning to fix for months, was expertly repaired, its hinges oiled. When the first light snow fell, he awoke to find the path from his door to the woodshed already cleared. Mrs. Henderson smiled knowingly when he mentioned these small mysteries. This town has a good memory, Elias, when it's properly jogged. One afternoon, as Elias was tending to his chickens, he saw a hesitant figure at the end of his drive. It was the boy with the straw-colored hair, the one who had led the mockery. He approached slowly, head down, kicking at a loose stone. "Mr. Thorne," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Elias straightened, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Yes?" The boy shuffled his feet. I heard what the general said about you in the war." He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a shame that was painful to witness. We We were real jerks to you, sir. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He gestured vaguely. Is there anything I can do? Chores? Anything around the farm? I'm stronger than I look." Elias studied the boy for a long moment. He saw not a malicious heart, but a thoughtless one, now wrestling with a hard-learned lesson. He nodded slowly. "There's always work on a farm, son. The woodpile needs stacking before winter truly sets in." A look of immense relief flooded the boy's face. "Yes, sir, I can do that." And so, an unlikely partnership began. The boy, whose name Elias learned was Billy, came by after school several times a week, his youthful energy a surprising help. He rarely spoke of the incident in the square, nor did Elias. The work itself became their common language, a silent acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and a quiet acceptance of atonement. The weight Elias had carried for so long, the sting of being unseen or misjudged, began to lift. It wasn't public glory he had ever sought, and it wasn't what he received. Instead, it was a quiet recognition, a restoration of dignity that settled into his bones like a balm. The loneliness that had been his constant companion since Martha's passing eased, replaced by a subtle sense of connection to the town he had always lived in, yet had only now truly become a part of. He still visited the war memorial, but now the path was often cleared by unseen hands, and the rosebush, his Martha's rosebush, seemed to flourish with an almost defiant vibrancy. Sometimes he'd find a small, carefully weeded patch around it, a silent tribute from someone in town. One crisp morning, a week before the first hard frost was predicted, Elias walked out to the edge of his west field, the one that caught the morning sun. In his trembling hands he carried 3 small apple saplings. Billy had helped him dig the holes the day before. Carefully, reverently, Elias knelt. He placed the first sapling into the earth, his gnarled fingers spreading its roots, tamping the soil gently around its tender base. He did the same with the other 2, lining them up along the old stone wall. New life, reaching for the sky. Later that week, a letter arrived. It bore no return address, only a simple stamp. Inside, on plain paper, was a carefully handwritten note. "Dear Mr. Thorne," it read, "my grandfather's name is on that stone in the square. He died in Korea. I used to wonder if anyone remembered him, or cared. Knowing you tend the roses there, and knowing what you did, makes me feel like he's not forgotten. Thank you for your service, and for still serving our memories. A grateful granddaughter." Elias read the letter twice, his vision blurring slightly. He folded it carefully and placed it in the old wooden box, alongside his medals. He then walked out onto his porch, looking out at his land, at the newly planted saplings that stood as small, hopeful sentinels against the vast open sky. The wind still whispered through the maples, but now it carried a different tune, less of mourning, more of a quiet, enduring peace. The world might often forget, but sometimes, if you were very lucky, it remembered, and sometimes that was enough.